Okay, this is a short little video on economic analysis in RFID, and actually it's applied to many different situations. But I'm going to talk about three things. One is alternative definition. And this occurs when you're proposing sort of a change in a situation. So going from maybe cycle counting or barcodes to an RFID situation. You might want to compare the old way versus the new way. And I'm going to talk through that. And then the second is looking at multi-criteria analysis, MCA is sometimes called. And then the last thing we're going to look at is the fully allocated cost calculation. So if you have a new product or actually any sort of new thing you're developing, you'll want to go through and estimate what is the cost of the item, and this will help you to do that. So first of all, with alternative definitions. So often the question is about where to make investments. And so companies want to clearly define what are the alternatives they're doing. Are we doing this or are we doing that? And then from there, you look at various methods of evaluation, but really looking at the alternatives becomes really important. So sometimes it's easy to decide, do we want to buy this factory or this machine? But sometimes it's not. If I'm replacing one system with another system, we want to capture what will change between the two systems. And we always have to remember there's a do-nothing alternative. So whenever we're doing these kind of alternative analysis, if they're both losing money, you could actually not do anything, and you have to always consider that. And the difficult part about this is you sort of have to be creative in brainstorming and said, if I did this particular alternative, what would be different than if I did that other alternative? So we don't care about things that are the same between two alternatives, like the CEO's salary. Those are going to be the same no matter which alternative, or maybe even the rent on a facility. That's not going to change depending on the alternative. But there might be a change in labor costs, there might be a change in maintenance cost, and we need to include all of that. So we only account for things that are different in the situations. So it's something like if we buy this pump or this pump, what are the differences? There might be initial cost differences, there might be ongoing maintenance differences, performance or life, but a lot of things are going to be the same, right? You might actually still be doing the same volume. There might be all kinds of things that are going to be the same, but you only look at things that are different. Another thing is, let's say if we lease a particular piece of equipment. So we have a down payment, and then we have ongoing costs associated with that. And I'm assuming you're familiar with these cash flow diagrams that are used in engineering economy, where the down arrow indicates a negative cash flow, and it's over time. So this is like a timeline. So the first one is you lease it, and the second is you buy it. You pay a lot more up front, but you don't have ongoing lease payments. So comparing those alternatives are something that you want to consider. You might also want to, like for your own personal investment, maybe I'm going to invest in a vending machine, or I'm going to buy Apple stock, or I'm going to invest in a friend's startup, or I'm going to do nothing. So you always are looking between alternatives, between things that you could do, and it's important to really understand how to defend those. There's also questions about what is the period you're considering, and almost always you try to do equal time periods. And we often put alternatives in the form of mutually exclusive, which means you can choose one. You can't do all of them. And that's just a sort of a standard in evaluations of alternatives. Now, this is an example particularly for RFID, and what I had you do in class is to look at this matrix and identify of these which row are kind of inputs to the system and which are calculated. Now, for instance, this first one is an input, the number of assets, and what we have listed across the top are the various alternatives. And then the second row is what's the time to track under the current method with a barcode and then with RFID. And then this then is the number of minutes, so that's calculated by the number of assets times the times per minute. Now, there's a lot of other things that are calculated in here, and in fact, one of the most important things is this total implementation cost. I have included on PolyLearn the solutions, so say like which of these are calculated, and so you can try to get to that. But this total implementation cost, you can see that in the current situation there's no implementation cost because you're sticking with it. But if you go to barcode, it's this much. If you go to passive RFID, it's this much. And if you go to active, it's this much. And then you also want to highlight that there's a difference in the the assets, the sort of tracking of assets that you can use each year. And so you want to delineate that. This number 2 is actually calculated from these equations, and I would urge you to figure out where that number comes from. But what this is saying is, if we make an initial cost of $53,000 into a barcode system, the annual savings is in the neighborhood of $21,000. If we make, which is 111 minus 90. If we make a $51,000 investment, the annual savings is quite a bit more, like $90,000. So this kind of lets you go that initial investment will do a savings, which is the difference between the current and the ongoing. So this is a good way to kind of lay out all of the finances associated with these two alternatives. Now, this doesn't work when you are doing like a new product, because you don't really have a current situation. You're just looking at what's the other things that are involved. But the next thing and so the question I have, is this applicable to your project? And I think maybe for sure for the autonomous robot, but maybe not the others. So the next thing I'm going to look at is multi-criteria analysis. And this is very similar, where we have the different alternatives laid out across each of these columns. But the criteria now is different things we might be looking at regarding this alternatives. So the rate of return, the flexibility, the sustainability, and we just sort of lay it out here in a way that we can look at everything together. Another way of doing this is to use sort of color coding. I don't know if you've ever seen Consumer Reports. They use this kind of color coding in their laying out of different cars or different refrigerators. They use this process. Another method is to do a scoring method. So you actually put weights associated with each of these criteria, and then we score each of these alternatives and then do a weighted average calculation. And from that, we can see that in this case, we get a highest score for alternative D. This is a really good method. This is actually used quite a bit in engineering, and systems engineering use it. It's kind of, they often refer to as a trade analysis. I think it would be a good method for you to think about when you're making decisions along in the design process. Now for RFID, this might be something else to just lay out all of this stuff. So in this case, we've contrasted barcodes, passive ID, and active RFID. And then we've included things like security, costs, standards, life, reading distance, potential interference. So to sort of contrast the different alternatives in a qualitative method, I would encourage this would be a really good thing for you to do too. So the next thing is looking at fully allocated costs. So in fully allocated costs, what we're really trying to get at all the time is the dollars per unit for an item. So we might want to look at this in three different sort of sections. And this is just the way we categorize fully allocated costs, just a way of making sure we're capturing all the costs. We categorize it as labor costs, which is direct labor, material, and overhead. And then we add those all up and we compare it to the selling price, and hopefully we will be getting a profit. But when you're starting a new product, this is definitely something you want to go through the process of looking at. So in labor, it says how long does it take to make it, and how much do we pay our employees. In materials, it's how much does the raw material cost, or the components cost, and then what if the raw materials, what quantity of each raw material is needed. And then in overhead, we look at all the other costs. What else is needed to make this product? Machine, rent, insurance, supervisors. And we try to quantify that and create it all into dollars per unit. So I'm going to go through this sort of section by section. So how much do you pay the employees? Lots of times you say, I'm just going to pay them, $12 an hour or something. But actually, the cost of the company is more than that. You have to include also taxes and benefits and time off. Lots of times people just use what's called sort of a burden rate, or an additional taxes rate of, say, 25%. That's a number you could use. So if you pay somebody $10 an hour, you actually are costing you $12.50 an hour. And then how long does it take? In this case, for industrial engineers, we learned how to do this through developing standard times, stopwatch time studies, work sampling, predetermined time standards, and we do this for each step in the process. So every time a person is doing something and you're paying them for it, you need to include it. And so you have to list out all those processes, how long it takes, and how much you're paying this person. And then what you're going to take is the hours per part, times the cost per labor, and that will give you $1 per unit of labor. The next section is materials. So how much raw materials, what is the dollars per unit, are there quantity discounts? It can get quite complex, but I think for your situation, all you're going to need to do is list out all the components you have to buy and how much they cost. And then look at things like either any packaging, make sure you include any kind of connectors or anything at all that you need to put into this system, material-wise. And then you'll get materials per part and then dollars per material, and that'll get you dollars per part. And overhead, this is probably the hardest one. So the question then becomes, how do I, if I have all these other expenses, like the website that I'm developing, the salespeople, the receptionist, the rent, the insurance, the supervisor, of all that other stuff that needs to be allocated to the part. Because if you just include labor and materials, and then you just charge a little bit over that, then you're not covering your overhead costs. So you need to allocate it. And it's really a question of allocation method. There's a lot of different allocation methods, but I would just include what the best way to do this is to get overhead per period. So rent, machine cost, anything you're doing like on a yearly basis. I'm going to be spending $20,000 to $200,000 a year on overhead, and my production for that period is going to be 1,000 units, so that's going to be $20 per unit is what I'm going to charge for overhead. I think that's the easiest way for you to go through that process. And then you'll add all those up, compare it to selling price, and the selling price is a whole nother question about where you get that selling price. You want to look at competitors, and you want to make sure you're charging more than it costs you. So all of those issues. So then the question is this applicable to your project? So I hope that's helped you a little bit in looking at the economics of RFID projects.